Great. Okay. Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Zanae Dames, the Marketing and Event Coordinator at Digital, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Reputational Risk in the Cyber Age, another fantastic subject as part of our webinar series at Digital. Before we get started, we respectfully acknowledge that in Canada, we live, work, and learn on the unceded traditional and ancestral land of Indigenous people. As myself and much of the Digital team are based in Vancouver, British Columbia, we are gathered here on the traditional ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge and let us know in the chat the traditional territory that you are joining us from. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with our audiences in the coming week. If at any point during the session you have a question, please type it into the chat and we'll address them at the end during the Q&A portion. That's it from me, and I'll be handing it over to Jane to get this webinar started. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Zanae. Bonjour, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful that we have attendees joining in with us from across the country for this month's webinar. And whether you're new or a returning participant to Digital's IP series, we're thrilled that you can join us for this Thought Leadership Power Hour. Data is an increasingly valuable asset, particularly given the increased adoption of generative AI. However, this rapid growth of generative AI and increased reliance on data has raised growing concerns around cybersecurity. Threats from malicious cyber activity are now more complex and greater than ever, and the attacks getting more sophisticated by the day. Of the 305 reported ransomware attacks to the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity last year, attackers accessed data in nearly 80% of cases and exfiltrated data in nearly 70%. With such incidents becoming far more common, the reputational and operational damage can be enormous, and all organizations, irrespective of size and industry, need to understand these risks and plan for them to minimize legal and reputational harm. Over these next 60 minutes, the discussion will center around key practical considerations and best practices to manage risks and plan an effective response plan, the landscape surrounding cyber risks in the context of generative AI, and demystifying that cybersecurity is predominantly an IT issue and rather an enterprise risk, requiring involvement from an organization's leadership team, with a Q&A portion to follow at the end. Next slide, please. Fundamental to the global innovation clusters is collaborative innovation and setting the framework for projects that address cross-country challenges whilst creating technology products and services that can scale across industries and ultimately across the world. Digital's IP strategy supports the development, ownership, and retention of Canadian IP through numerous vehicles, and informational sessions with thought leaders like we've today are one example of that. Next slide, please. I have the pleasure of introducing two thought leaders with us. Please join me in welcoming Dominic Vogel and Imran Ahmad. Dominic is CEO of CyberSC, a Vancouver-based cybersecurity leadership company. A cybersecurity thought leader, his experience spans a multitude of industries, including financial services, healthcare, government, telecommunications, and critical infrastructure, and he actively participates in the global security community and frequently appears on media news outlets across both North America and internationally on BBC. Dominic serves as an external cyber risk advisor to various boards of directors and executives, a member of BC's Provincial Security Advisory Council, and host of Cybersecurity Matters podcast, exploring the intersection between cybersecurity and business. Imran is partner, head of technology, and Canadian co-head of information governance, privacy, and cybersecurity practice at Norton Rose Fulbright. A leading cybersecurity lawyer, he advises clients across all industries on an array of technology-related matters, and his cybersecurity practice includes developing cyber threat and data breach strategies, advising on legal risk assessments, data breach incidents preparedness and response, managing complex incidents, and acting as breach counsel. He is author of Cybersecurity in Canada, a guide to best practices, planning, and management, Canada's first legal incident preparation and response handbook. Former chair of the Privacy and Access to Information section of the Ontario Bar Association, and an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto, where he teaches
Jen?
Yes?
Sorry. Dominic, are you able to hear Jen? I think you're breaking up in the webinar.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
So now let's turn our attention to our speakers and kick off this discussion. Cyber crime is less a hypothetical risk these days. It's a real risk. Dominic, I'm wondering if you can start us off by sharing your thoughts from your respective vantage points.
Well, first of all, it's really nice to be joining everyone today, and apologies, I'm fighting off a cold, so I'll be clearing my throat more so than usual today. But from my perspective, and I deal with a lot of small and mid-sized organizations in the country, and I think we're still at this tipping point where a lot of small and mid-sized organizations still view cybersecurity or cyber risk as a theoretical risk. Unless it's happened to them, they don't believe it to be real. But as we're seeing with each passing day, each passing ransomware incident, every especially like I said, at the SMB level, organizations are getting hit day after day after day. So we're, I suppose, converting the non-believers into believers. And I think really what we're projecting into is this realization that this isn't just an IT issue. This isn't just something that you hand off to an IT guy or your IT service provider. This is very much a risk. It is a business risk, and no different than how you treat operational risk, financial, personnel, strategic risk. It's something which absolutely needs to be thought of at the upper echelons of any organization. So we're moving into that branch of this being a practical, not theoretical thing that organizations need to grapple with.
Thank you. Imran?
Yeah, I'll jump in and I want to echo Dominic's view of, first of all, thanking everyone for the opportunity to be here, and in particular for organizing this webinar in the middle of summer where I know people are busy. So really appreciate people making time for this important topic. One of the key things that Dominic mentioned was this tipping point we're at. And there's two components to it, just to give you and the audience a bit of a sense of numbers. So last year in 2022, our firm alone in Canada, so Norton Rose is a global firm, but just the Canadian operations, we managed over 500 breaches in the country. So that's one law firm. If you couple that with the variety of law firms that are out there, if you couple the fact that some people do not get law firms involved at all, the number is staggering in terms of the number of attacks that are happening. And a lot of these hackers are trying to be innovative. It's the path of least resistance. How can they get to a point where they can actually get a payment? The majority of these threat actors are criminals trying to make a quick buck by extorting victim organizations. And so one of the key themes I know we're going to talk about a bit later in our discussion here today is the impact on the organization. What does that mean? The second part that I wanted to touch on very quickly here is the reputational piece, but that's driven by the data. So when you were making the very kind introduction about, the privacy work I do in particular, I will tell you, organizations across the board, maybe employee information, consumer information, third-party data that's transferred over, or a variety of all of those together, you're going to be collecting a ton of information. So when a breach occurs, either within your IT environment or externally, the reputational impact is going to be very significant. You're going to have to explain why this happened. And really, one of the key things I hope our audience will be able to take away from today's session is it's not the fact that you had a breach. That's not what you're going to be judged on. Nobody's is held to a standard of excellence and perfection. What they are, basically measured on is how did they respond to the breach? Did they have a preparation plan in place? Did they have a methodology where they systematically approached the issue and dealt with it effectively? And did they act like a reasonable, appropriate corporate citizen to notify their key stakeholders? So, for example, there are a ton of these that are going on right now, and I'm sure we'll talk about them. They're called zero-day vulnerabilities. So these are basically vulnerabilities in a software or a solution, technology solution, which is not even known by the creator of the software itself. I'm grossly simplifying it, but that's what it is. You see a situation where these zero-day exploitations occur, and then the vendor that was impacted doesn't even tell their customer for days or weeks on end, and that's a problem. So you're going to be judged on how quickly you notify individual stakeholders, either consumers, business partners, board of directors, government officials, regulators, you name it. And then how do you actually engage with them to make sure that you're taking the right steps at the end of the day to minimize any negative impact? That's what a successful breach response is. And one last point, I'll hand it back over to you, is you mentioned the course I teach at the University of Toronto. The last session I do is typically a cyber simulation that we go through the whole anatomy of a breach itself. And one of the things I ask students to think about is, there's no right or wrong answer, but if I was to ask them, give me an example of one or two breaches that were in the press that were, in your view, even though you're not inside of that organization, in your view, was not well managed. They could all pretty much across the board agree to two or three of them that were in the media. And the reason for that is their key identifiers: slowness of response, a response that seems to be a bit more ad hoc, them being, where we can't talk to you because we got lawyers involved. Those are not good answers. They may be, factually accurate perhaps, but they're not the right answer when you're thinking about it from a reputational, brand, goodwill perspective. So I'm sure we're going to unpack a lot of these issues and have this conversation, but just wanted to level set with that piece that may be helpful for the audience here.
Thank you both. And I think, yeah, you've definitely sort of set the stage for unpacking a bit more of that. And I think one of the things maybe that we can get into a little bit with you both is, each of you sort of from your vantage points, walking us through, some of those mitigation efforts, that organizations, regardless sort of the size and industry, as you're sort of seeing it across the spectrum, can put into place to help ward off these cyber threats. Imran, you've started a little bit there, and Dominic as well. So if you both would share that with our audience.
I guess I'll go first. I love how what Imran was table setting there, and one of the bits which I'd love to even just to extend a bit further is the whole notion about going beyond just focusing on cybersecurity as just a preventative only game. For far too long, and Imran did a wonderful job laying this out there. Success in security has been equated with no data breaches or just only preventative measures, and that just sets everyone up for failure. I think that the principle that we're certainly trying to convey to our clients at CyberSC is a concept of resilience. And so the analogy I always give is to think about something like the resilience in the face of something like cancer. You can't, to be truly resilient against something against cancer, you can't just focus on preventative, because sometimes the prevention fails. Sometimes it doesn't always work. So you need to couple that with early detection and rapid response. And in the cyber age, and when it comes to cybersecurity, I think we need to take that same type of approach to that. When we're talking about preventative, yes, it's important, but far too many organizations, if you look at their security controls right now, I would say many of them have 80% plus of their controls are just preventative, and they're not giving enough weight to the early detection and rapid response controls or even policies or processes. So I think that's so important, especially at the small mid-sized business level where I primarily play and where CyberSC primarily focuses. So many of them still just focus on it as we have antivirus, we have all these technologies from 20 years ago, we must be good, right? And it's the truth of the matter is that it's not. And I always jokingly say that it's not 1995 anymore, right? The controls that you may have used in the past certainly aren't worthwhile in 2023, and we need to really update the mindsets of many business owners and executives in this, particularly in the SMB space in this country, to help them realize that just because you don't have what you perceive to be as sensitive data assets, in this day and age, every organization is digitally driven. They are data driven. So even if you don't have a ton of personal health information or personal information, your company relies on the data to fulfill its mission in terms of serving its clients and serving its customers. And criminals know that. So if they knock offline your systems or knock off access to that data is valuable to someone. It's valuable to you. It's valuable to your organization. And criminals know that. So we really, like I said, more than anything, I really would like to see business owners and executives at the SMB space really update their mindset and recognizing that hiding behind we don't have sensitive data doesn't do anything anymore. You may have been able to get away with that 10, 15 years ago, but that doesn't hold now. So to me, like I said, I think it's really about moving beyond prevention and recognizing that, like I said, in this day and age, that every company does have sensitive data, even if it's not the sensitive data that we've somewhat accustomed ourselves to in terms of like personal information or PII.
I'll jump in, and Dominic, you pointed out a term that really resonated with me, which is resiliency, and I'd like to share a few slides. I promise I won't make this a very slide heavy discussion, but I think it'll be helpful just for the audience to see this. So when we talk about the threat landscape, we often, and I in particular like this one survey that's done by the World Economic Forum, and they touch on different aspects, and basically they ask world leaders, C-suite executives, government officials, and a variety of them, from your perspective, what are the things that are going to be on your radar for the upcoming year? And the most recent survey that's come out, no surprise, had cybersecurity on it and different aspects of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity for sure, but privacy and artificial intelligence, in particular, how it relates to it, was amongst the top 10, not only top 10, actually the top 3, and had in the next 0 to 2 year time frame that's going to be a top concern for those executives. And when you break down the cyber risk, which is pretty broad, what are you really concerned? What aspect of cyber risk really keeps you up at night? It's really the operational disruption, the reputational piece, which is really the theme of today's webinar, financial losses, and obviously legal and regulatory, which is, as a lawyer, something that we're really conscious of. So when we come to how can you prepare, like this is pretty massive risk for an organization if you're looking at those 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, all of those types of risks. How do we actually mitigate those? Well, you focus on resiliency. It's not standard of perfection. And resiliency basically has 2 KPIs if you want to really simplify it. Broadly speaking, resiliency is the ability of an organization to be punched in the gut and be able to stand back up and operate again. And the 2 metrics I use is that of a house which is going to be burglared. Think of a house which has an alarm system on it. It's a nice house, it's your house, and a burglar is in your neighborhood trying to scope out which house he or she can break into. And they see your home. The first KPI is the ability to reduce the time frame to detect the incident. So if you've got an alarm system and that burglar tries to break in through the door or the window or just tries to wiggle the knob and the alarm goes off, you're going to be in a great place, because at that point, it's alerting the right authorities, it's alerting you, and you can take immediate steps. The more you know and the sooner you know, the more you can respond, number 1. So that's KPI or metric number 1 for resiliency. The second one is the depth. So if the threat actor breaks into your home, so the burglar is able to get into your house, but your alarm doesn't go off because in the morning you forgot to turn it on as you were rushing off to work, or the alert that it's supposed to go to the telephone number or the text message it's supposed to send to isn't the correct one. So it's going, there's an alert, but it's not going to the right place. At that point, the threat actor, or the burglar in this case, can walk through the house and pretty much with impunity for a few hours, rummage through your valuables and steal what they want and cause a lot of damage. Similar to your environment, where if your detection systems aren't in place in a proper way, they're not configured a proper way, theoretically a threat actor can walk in and steal exactly those valuable information that Dominic was talking about, trade secrets or IP, intellectual property, or other types of data as well. So resiliency is really, let's reduce the time frame for detection and response, and let's make sure they don't, even if they get through the first layer, that they can't go too deep into the IT environment. If they can, then we're going to have some issues, because the deeper they're going to go, arguably, the deeper the damage is going to be within the organization. Just for the audience's benefit, and I put this on the screen just as an indicator, that I always get asked, Cameron, what are you really concerned about? And this list changes all the time. You have ransomware, third-party breaches, business email compromise, but at the beginning of the year, it was denial of service attacks, and that number changes, and the list constantly gets evolved over time. The reason for that is threat actors are smart. When we had the Russia-Ukraine war commence, at the time, a lot of ransomware groups disbanded and rebranded themselves into different names. They kept a low profile. The demands for the ransom attacks were very, very low compared to what we had seen previously. But on the flip side, we had seen an increase on business email compromises, which is basically wire fraud. Essentially, they take control of your email account, they figure out who your key vendors are, then they transfer funds, because the infrastructure cost of that was extremely low. All you need to do is intercept an email or have somebody's credentials compromised. So these techniques change depending on global climate, in terms of what the threat actor is trying to do. The cost for infrastructure, ransomware is much more complex than it would be, let's say, for a business email compromise. So this list is there, but be cognizant that these attacks will change constantly. I'll just share one more slide and I'll hand it back over to you, because I think it sort of ties into a lot of the great points that Dominic was mentioning. And the numbers that you have here are probably less relevant, because these numbers keep changing all the time in terms of what the cost of dealing with the breach is, but they're significant. I think the bigger piece that you want to focus on is assessing the value of the data. And the data, it's not just personal information. And I'm a big proponent of privacy and making sure you secure that information, employees and consumers. But corporations, especially those who are starting out, scaling up, enterprise level have a ton of information which is sensitive beyond just personal information. They'll have information on intellectual property that they've developed. Imagine industrial designs, which we have had cases publicly where threat actors have dumped that on the dark web. Think about, for example, other third-party information that you may be receiving that you're required to keep confidential, but that gets compromised, and now the threat actors threatening you to release that information if you do not make them a payment. And then they will also look at, believe it or not, if you have cyber insurance. There's cyber insurance is very, very popular these days. And you may have 2 million, 5 million, or whatever amount of insurance coverage there. Threat actors, when they get into your IT environment, will make sure they understand and look for those documents. Say, hey, we'd like to get paid $2 million. And you'll say, well, I don't have $2 million. Well, your insurance policy, which here's the excerpt of that we put in front of you, does. So talk to your insurer and pay us X millions of dollars. So the insurance component is important as well. But the key takeaway here is, especially in the age of AI, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, in the Q&A as well. In the age of AI, you're going to see an explosion, if you haven't seen it already, in terms of the data that you're collecting. Either the data that you already have that you're repurposing. So if you maybe have collected employee information for years, but really never done anything with it, now you have the opportunity to pull that information in, use it in some kind of AI or machine learning type technology algorithm, and then generate new data points. That could get compromised. Or you may say, hey, you know what? I'm in this industry, never really collected these insights. Let's collect these additional data points. And now you're just basically creating a new bank of data that's going to be there that could arguably be either personal information or other types of sensitive data. So all this to say, understanding your data, and I have a slide on this a bit later, which I'm happy to share with the audience, which talks about the data mapping piece, making sure that you understand what data you have, where you have it, and how you're protecting it, because that's going to give you really good insight what your potential digital footprint risk looks like. So maybe with that, Jen, I'll hand it back over to you, but I'll come back with some of the other slides a bit later.
Yeah, that would be great. I think there's a couple of things that you touched upon that the audience will definitely want to hear more on. And I'm just wondering with you both, as you sort of talked about some of these sort of a bit of a framework for these mitigation efforts, is some of the things you talked about, Imran, as well, that include approaches such as, insurance and protocols, and maybe sort of from both of your lenses, if you have a little bit more about expanding on that before we get into some of the more sort of practical questions, around sort of the board and other stuff and the data side. I think it would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'd love to just on the framework side, and the thing too with cybersecurity frameworks is that there are lots of them. Like, there's no shortage of frameworks, and for me, I think it's really important for an organization to use it as a guiding light. Again, you don't need to be super dogmatic about them because most frameworks are pretty much all very, very similar. I always say 80% of them are all pretty much the same. There's maybe some nuances here and there, but find a framework that works best for you. Right. So if you're a smaller organization, the Canadian government has a really great framework. There's one called the CIS, Critical Security Controls which are more geared towards smaller organizations. There's some bigger ones as well, like the NIST cybersecurity framework. That one is, again, fairly detailed, but again, it's not always practical for for smaller organizations, maybe geared more so towards larger organizations. So either work internally with a team, or bring in a cybersecurity advisor or your legal advisor, someone like Imran, to help you understand what framework is most appropriate for our organization. Far too often, one of the major problems I see with a lot of our prospects and people who become our clients is that they go down a path for cybersecurity, for measuring their maturity and taking a framework, and it's one that isn't right size, or it's not customized, it's not fit to their business, or it's not fit to their risk context. So don't just pick a framework and try and bludgeon it to death. Find something and work it and customize it so it fits your organization. Because ultimately, like I said, you don't want to be dogmatic to it to the point where it's being detrimental to your organization or slowing innovation or slowing growth. Then that's not the whole point. To me, a good cybersecurity framework should be securing your business growth, right? It's about really having that opportunity to move forward from a growth perspective and be very confident that things are secured. And like I said, that profit, that growth window, which hopefully leads to more profits if you're a for-profit organization, is well underway. So to me, like I said, don't just marry yourself to a framework. Again, depending if what sector you're in. There may be some regulatory frameworks you need to adhere to, but like I said, take the opportunity to identify what works best for you and for your organization, and if you need to, engage a third-party partner or consultant to guide that, and then like I said, use that and then measure year after year after year. How are we improving and maturing as an organization when it comes to cyber risk management? That's the last bit that I'll mention. This little side ramble here is don't, like I said earlier, don't hold yourself to the goal of perfection, recognizing that this is the proverbial journey and it needs to be ingrained in the DNA of your organization. It needs to be ingrained in the fabric of the organization. And as your organization evolves, your security evolves. So if you're a 50-person company right now, how you do security should be right sized for a 50-person company. If you suddenly have plans to balloon to a 500 or 5,000 person company, well, it stands to reason that your approach to cybersecurity and cyber risk management should change as well. So build that into the framework and adapt. But like I said, sort of the old adage, what got you here won't get you to where you're going. So that's the same is true with security.
And Dominic, before we jump into Imran, I just wanted to ask you sort of quickly, was there anything sort of, sort of a couple of items that you're really seeing that are coming up for organizations, even sort of as Imran sort of framed what's happening in this last year or two, and especially with the situation, with Russia, Ukraine, and sort of other sort of threats that are happening that are changing that more rapidly from your lens?
Yeah, the thing that I'm seeing with a lot of, we deal with a lot of B2B organizations, and Imran had it listed in one of his slides there, but the whole notion of third-party risk. And one of the things which we've been seeing with a lot of organizations, and I guess as from a broader supply chain risk perspective, and as sort of vendor risk management has sort of trickled down from enterprise and is now affecting smaller organizations, we're seeing smaller organizations that primarily sell to larger businesses and large organizations, that they're now in a spot where they have to take security seriously. And this is anecdotal, but these things are absolutely true. We have received calls from prospects saying, "Hey, we have a client. It makes up 60% of our annual revenue, and they're clamping down on cybersecurity. We've been telling them for years we were taking security seriously, but actually we haven't. They're calling us out, and we need to show that we're doing X, Y, Z. Can you help us?" I kid you not, like that's the type of stuff that we have heard and seen, and like as I really see that broader supply chain risk management issue really now trickling down to affecting smaller B2B organizations. A lot of them in the manufacturing sector. Historically, my organization's been around for 10 years. Manufacturing has been a very hard sector for us to break into. This past, I'm going to say, year to 18 months, we've onboarded more manufacturing clients than in all previous years combined. They're really feeling the pinch when it comes to supply chain risk management, and as they should. I think it's a nice call to reckoning that now they're taking this seriously.
Thanks, Dominic. Imran, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, no, there's some great points that Dominic made. I'm going to try to unpack some of them as well and add to it because there's some great thoughts there. So, Dominic mentioned the term framework, and for anyone who's looking at frameworks, it can be a bit daunting. There's so many of them out there. Some sound cooler than others. Dominic mentioned NIST. There's the Lockheed kill chain. There's a variety of them that are out there. But let me take a step back as to why is a framework even required? Why do you even care that it matters? And the reason is quite simple. If you go back to the very basics of it, at the end of the day, you don't want to do anything piecemeal. Like I can have a policy written somewhere, stored away in a drawer, but if I'm not following it, it doesn't mean anything. Or if it doesn't fit into a broader strategy or approach, it doesn't mean anything. What a framework does, it gives you a bird's eye view of how you're actually managing your entire security environment. Everything ranging from the technical security safeguards that you may have, all the way up to the governance piece, legal, policy related, everything in between as well. So what it does is, in the event you have a breach, and I'll tell you how this really works. When you have a breach, you're going to have, let's say, a business partner or a regulator, or let's say you end up in litigation, the other party, the opposing counsel, ask you, well, Imran, your client, show us they actually thought about security. What steps did they take? Well, you can't just say, well, they had MFA in place and multi-factor authentication. That's not a strategy. That's a tactic. That is a particular tool you implemented. Show us you thought about security more broadly speaking, that your client was nimble. If you have a framework the framework will start with large principles and then break it down to specific requirements that go for each one of them. So that's the purpose of a framework. And I think it's important to know why you adopt a framework. That's number one. Number two, and I'll just show my colors here. I'm a bit partial to NIST because it is a good framework. It's good in the sense that it is something that's scalable. So we have clients who are SMBs, they're mid-market or large enterprise clients as well. And what it does is when you look at the NIST framework, it allows you to scale up or scale down depending on what your needs are. You can pick and choose essentially what would be appropriate for your organization. The additional value, and this is where, from an AI and a privacy perspective, it helps because it comes together with cyber. What NIST has done is they've got the cybersecurity framework. They've developed over the years a privacy framework which cross-references one another. And they're currently working on an AI framework. So if you can only have one broad framework which cross-references everything, you're going to be in a much more holistic approach. So again, I'm not a salesperson for NIST by any stretch, but I do find they have thought that through and they've gone through multiple years of consultation to get feedback from industry as well. So that's the second piece. The last piece I'll mention is, how do you get yourself organized? Short of getting a certification like an ISO or a SOC type of certification, when it comes to frameworks, the benefit is you can literally have a spreadsheet. And you can have all of these elements listed. And I'll give you a quick pro tip here if you're interested. If you go to the NIST frameworks, whichever one, privacy, cyber, there's one for AI that's being developed, as I mentioned as well. In the appendices, they actually have the list of broad categories and sub-requirements that go along with it. You literally copy, paste, and you put that into a spreadsheet. And then you work with your information governance people, your IT, InfoSec folks, or anyone else within the organization who's touching on different aspects of these, and you just populate and assign. And if you see gaps at a bird's eye view, you're going to be able to say, well, we have some deficiencies here, but we're really strong in this area. And then you can actually allocate dollars and cents to those pieces that are missing. And more importantly, when you're sitting across negotiating an agreement with a business partner, or if you have a breach and the business partner asks you a question, you pull out that spreadsheet and you can cross-reference and say, specifically, here's the 5 things we did. Here's the people who had ownership of it. Look, cybersecurity is very difficult. Threat actors are getting sophisticated, but we did have measures, and nonetheless, this incident occurred, and here's how we've responded to it. So I think, Dominic laid a really good overview of that. I just add a little couple points there, but I'm sure we'll be able to answer any additional questions in the Q&A as well.
And if I can kind of flesh out a little bit more on that sort of what you both sort of have talked about is that one, that this is sort of going just beyond sort of the IT function. There's so many multiple actors and stakeholders in an organization in this. And I think, to one of sort of the questions that sort of we kicked off a bit earlier is around, having the oversight and the inputs of, the board, the leadership team, sort of these other sort of, cross-functional actors, whether they were sort of within the organization or, sort of close to, but arm's sort of length away involved, from your lens, from a practical perspective, what are some of those, sort of whether they're non-technical security questions, or sort of other questions that organizations, can be asking and engaging of their board, of the leadership team, of, ensuring that there's that broader conversation to foster discussions on the right oversight, the right guidance from that security strategy perspective and that cultural piece.
Yeah. So
go ahead, Dominic.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I'll take you up on that. That's a really great question, Jen. To me, where it really starts is focusing around data, right? Taking that data-centric approach and being able to say and have these conversations at the board and executive levels, even starting off with what is the most critical business processes? Like, what are the business processes that absolutely make this organization tick and run? And then being able to map that back to, okay, well, what is the most critical data that supports those processes? What are the most critical systems that support those critical business processes? Starting there allows, I'd say, for the formulation of the initial security strategy, because if we're focusing on securing the wrong systems or securing the wrong data, we're not doing security efficiently, nor are we doing it effectively. So I think starting around that is key, and then peeling further back from that and establishing risk tolerances and risk appetites. So again, asking at the board and asking at the executive level. So for critical system or critical business process A, how long is the organization willing to tolerate that business process being unavailable? Is it measured in minutes? Is it measured in hours? Is it measured in days? If it's measured in weeks, it's probably not critical, but at least having that conversation there. And then if they say, okay, well, this business process A is it needs to be up and running in, if we're down for more than 10 minutes, we're going to be screaming. Okay, great. Well, now we can formulate appropriate budgeting and costing and systems and processes around that to allow that to happen, because how you secure and support a system that its uptime is measured in minutes, very different than if something that can go down for 3 days or 5 days or what have you, right? So having that formulating the conversation around that is super important, and even from a perspective of the data availability. So if an event of ransomware, as an example, if 3 days worth of data was destroyed, is that something that is acceptable to the executives and to the board, right? And then being able to foster discussions around that, like I said, helps to establish risk tolerance, helps just to establish risk appetite, of which a cybersecurity strategy can be built upon. Because one of the things that we see happening right now with a lot of organizations, especially smaller ones that have boards, is that the board or the executives tend to be disengaged from the cybersecurity strategy. And what ends up happening is the IT team or the IT service provider ends up doing what I'll just call best effort or best guess. And we experienced this recently with a client with a prospect that reached out, and they got hit by ransomware, and they had assumed that their IT team had set up their backup systems so that they could recover data basically within a matter of hours. But the IT team, never having this discussion and never really engaged at the board or executive level, they just made the assumption that they could get up and running within 3 days, and they thought that was sufficient. Needless to say, it wasn't, and that's sort of where you have hand A not talking to hand B. And that example there that happens just countless times across the Canadian SMB space. It really does. So I think really, like I said, starting with that data-centric conversation, focusing around the critical business processes and going down from that, that's the spot to start with the engagement. Because if you just go to the board or go to the executives and say, what's your tolerance for cyber risk? They'll just look at you and not really know how to answer. So start around the stuff that they know, and that's the critical business processes. Sorry, over to you, Imran.
Yeah, no, that's great. A little bit of commentary from me. So I'll just share the story because I think it's important for the audience to hear how the discussion around AI and AI risk in particular has changed at the senior leadership and board levels over the past few months. So we all know ChatGPT came out or was officially launched on November 30th, 2022. So roughly about 9 months ago. And I remember very, very well, middle of December, I was on a call. To be quite honest, I wasn't even aware of a formal launch of ChatGPT. And I had a client on from the health sector asking me a specific question about security safeguards related to their health platform. And, we had a conversation, said we'd get back to them within a day or two with some additional feedback and left it at that. 15 minutes later, I kid you not, I get an email saying, this is what ChatGPT has said. And now the client was not challenging our view, but because we hadn't given ours, but, it was something that they had actually looked at and said, can you think about it? So they were using the tool. The reason that's relevant is I'd say the relationship with ChatGPT and generative AI, and now more broadly AI and machine learning, has been a story of two stories. Story number one, extreme excitement at the beginning. Oh my gosh, we are going to be able to be super efficient. Here's all the upside to it. Let's go ahead and launch this, and let's think about all the creative things that can come out of it and make our life simpler, and so on and so forth. And then you probably notice over the past few months, there's been more hesitation. There's been more questions about, is this the right thing to do? Even if we can do it, should we be doing it? Should we wait for more, frameworks? And I mean, from a regulatory standpoint, legal frameworks to be in place before we implement, large scale technology related to AI. And the reason those two stories are relevant is when you get to the board level or when you get to leadership, most companies are not deciding to reinvent entirely their organization with AI. What they're looking to do right now is implement through bolt-on solutions, something that will improve or incrementally improve their overall efficiencies and productivity related to AI. And so the question then becomes for these boards, for these leadership teams, is what is our approach? What is our philosophy related to AI. Just because we can do it, should we be doing it or not? And so we're seeing a lot of frameworks and governance committees being created within companies saying, okay, let's talk it through before we implement anything where we at a large scale adopt or collect information and adopt AI as a tool on a go forward basis. Let's make sure we actually canvass it and think about it and get the views of the organization's philosophy and culture. And then secondly, let's get some legal structure around that as well to make sure it's all above board. So I'd say, when it comes to AI in particular, there's a lot of focus on the governance piece at the most senior level of the organization to make sure they actually know how they're going to approach it. So it's a systematic approach going forward, as opposed to let's go after the big shiny thing that's out there that's being pitched to us, implement it, and then have risk that we may be taking on that we were not necessarily comfortable taking on in the first instance.
Thank you, Imran. I'm wondering also too, it sort of is tying in as we talk about generative AI and to Dominic's point, as he started around sort of the data piece, if you can kind of, unpack a little bit more that you had around the sort of the data mapping and really sort of from that organizational standpoint, what folks are needing to look at and understand as they approach this.
Sure. And I'll take it from two perspectives, one from cybersecurity, and then I'll come to the AI component afterwards. So from a cybersecurity standpoint, I'll tell you, the key point that we were talking about earlier is the ability to respond and respond effectively. That all sounds very logical and intuitive, but actually in practice is quite difficult. So when folks like Dominic and others who come in, when they get the phone call at 2 a.m. and before a long weekend, which is typically the norm, okay, we've been hacked, now what? Now, think of it this way. You have your house. Let's use that analogy again. You know your house has been broken into. You don't know what door or window was broken into necessarily. You don't know what rooms they have gone into. And before you do anything at all, before you even step into the house, you want to make sure it's safe, right? You don't know if the threat actor or the burglar in that case is still in the home. So making sure you secure the environment is really critical. Once you have that, the second step, which you typically have, is the cops will come in, they'll secure the premises, and then they'll do a mini investigation. They'll look at, okay, the person went through the kitchen, went through the bedroom, went to so on and so forth. So you have an idea how they moved around and what they may have done. And then you'll have hopefully an idea of what they actually took. And that takes time. So similar to an investigation, mission number one is make sure that you contain the environment as much as possible, that you have good visibility, the threat actor is not actively moving what we call laterally in your environment. Secondly, you want to secure your environment so they can't break back into it in case they had a backdoor. But the hardest part is the data component. And this is where the law meets the technical piece. So figuring out by looking at breadcrumbs, digital breadcrumbs, where they were and working your way backwards on the chronology of how they actually walked into your environment and what they did and what they may have taken, that can take weeks. And for all kinds of reasons, under privacy legislation, under our financial institution legislation, soon to be critical infrastructure laws as well, there's a requirement to notify stakeholders and government officials relatively quickly. You can't sit on an investigation for weeks on end, either because the law requires you to respond quicker, or if you were to notify impacted individuals 6 weeks after, they're going to be unhappy about the fact that it took them so long because they were potentially at risk during that period of time. So why does this all matter? And back to your question about data mapping, the clients who have had the most effective response are the clients who have said, you know what, I know exactly where my data is. I know it's sitting on this particular server in a database form, and I know that it's been updated only on these dates, and here's how it was ring fenced. And once you know that specific piece, you can let the investigators know, like, I'm concerned about privacy issues, go look at that server first and foremost. If you do not have that visibility about what systems and what databases are located where and what may have been, you are going to be looking at everything, and that will drag out your investigation. So from a mapping perspective, there's tools, right? This is not somebody who sits at their desk and manually inputs on a spreadsheet what data they're seeing on a particular system. There are softwares and all kinds of technology which are very cost effective that you can run, and you run it for the most critical pieces of information, IP, legal internal department, for example, personal information, consumer information, employee data. It's pretty straightforward stuff, but you do have to spend the time to organize it. So that's on the cybersecurity side of things. On the AI one, it's a bit more complex, and really it depends what you're trying to do. I'm going to grossly simplify this for our audience, and I apologize if it sounds too simplistic, but for sake of efficiency, I'll just keep it pretty short. I think of the algorithm being really the tool here. So you take On one end, the raw data. You just collect raw data. This is your data set that's coming in. Public data set, private data set, or data set that you're building yourself. It really doesn't matter. It could be a hybrid, but data that's coming in. The algorithm inputs all of this stuff. It digests it in and then has an output that comes out. Either something which analyzes or it creates new sets of data. You can call it derivative data or something else. Doesn't really matter. But an output of data. And that's what AI typically does. It has a predictive capability, but it also has other types of abilities that can be built into it. That data set on the front end can be anything. Could be, for example, collecting IP addresses that are visiting your e-commerce site. It could be all the information you've collected through ADP or Workday, which is your HR management system, to be able to take those analytics from the back end and then revise them to see if you can identify diversity and other types of metrics on your employee database. So you are collecting a lot of information. Often it is unstructured data, and tagging that data and cataloging it, just like you're doing for the other types of data we talked about, can sound a bit daunting, but again, there are tools that can do that as long as you consciously know what you're going to be doing. Last point, then happy to hand it back over to you or to flesh this out even further. The other piece that comes up on generative AI is this: everybody wants to use it, right? So you want to use ChatGPT, you want to use Bard or whatever other tool that's out there, Copilot and so on. You have a lot of organizations that are adopting, just like they have acceptable use policy manuals, or adopting new manuals when it comes to the use of ChatGPT. What can you input or not input into it? You're not to input personal information, for example. You cannot use it for code development in some cases. In other cases, you can. And here's what the parameters look like. So in your internal policy for the use of generative AI tools or the like, which a lot of companies are doing, like I said, you want to make sure you stipulate what data they are allowed to input and those that they're not allowed to input as well.
Thank you, Imran. As we wait, I think it looks like we may have lost Dominic here for a second as he's jumping back in. Just wondering, sort of one of the questions that's coming up. Oh, there's Dominic. We can let him hop into the data piece as he connects back in. Hi, Dominic. Over to you.
Hi. Sorry, my finding it security related. My Windows machine decided to update there and reboot there, so I'm now on my mobile device. So apologies about that. Security can be inconvenient at times.
We were just talking about the data. Imran just finished on the data side of things, and it kind of segues a little bit into what you were talking to earlier, and sort of one of the questions that sort of come in a little bit around sort of, you know, what types of data, you know, are concern, you know, and to your point earlier about, you know, that organizations think we don't maintain anything that might be sensitive, personal, or otherwise. If you can flesh that out a little bit. For
sure, Jen. Yeah, you know, I one of the things, and like I primarily deal with organizations at the 50 to 500, so 50 employees to 500, and many of them, when it comes to cybersecurity, they just feel like they're not dealing with important data, right? To them, they feel like it can't be sold on the dark web, so there's nothing worth protecting. You know, and I think, like I was mentioning earlier, recognizing that we are in a very data-driven world, and especially, like as Imran was saying there, with AI and generative AI, we're going to just be seeing even more data growth and data explosion for organizations. So taking a more data-centric approach to cybersecurity is going to be increasingly more important, and recognizing that when we're talking about the concept of resilience as well, we can't just try and have some blanket thing where we're protecting everything, right? So being really in tune with what data is most critical to your organization, and like I said, abstracting that up a level, as I mentioned earlier, tying that to what are the most critical business processes in your organization. So if you know that, really you're in tune with what makes your organization tick and how it is that you support your customers, your clients, then you're able to have a much more successful, I'd say, mapping exercise in terms of what data is most important. And like Imran perfectly identified there, this isn't a manual exercise, right? There are great data governance platforms, tools, things to really help you identify, again, not just the what data, but the where does it live, who has access to it, right? Why is it being used? That additional context will help to make sure that it's as secure as possible. And especially as we enter a generative AI state, a data explosion state, knowing those answers to those questions is increasingly more important.
Thank you. Another sort of question that comes to mind here is, and Imran, you sort of touched upon a little bit from a legislative side, and without going sort of, you know, a lot into that, is, you both have talked about, sort of doing some of those inventories and, understanding sort of, systems. Are there also some additional practical measures that organizations can consider implementing when, for example, positioning themselves to react to, legislative changes, such as, for example, the introduction of Bill C-26. Last week, the SEC just laid out brand new sort of rules around cybersecurity breach. And involving third-party application failures and those things. Are there other nuggets that you can share with our audience?
Sure, I can kick it off, and Dominic, feel free to jump in because you probably see a lot of this from a practical standpoint as well. So I won't make this a legal webinar by any stretch, but let me just share a couple of things that folks should have on their radar. You mentioned one of them. So you may hear the term C-26, which is basically a piece of legislation that's been proposed in Parliament, federal Parliament, that will touch on critical infrastructures. And if you want to look at a quick definition of critical infrastructure, you can Google Public Safety Canada. There's a list of 10 broad categories ranging from telecommunication, financial institutions, ports, hospitals, and so on. The key there is going to be really to make sure that there's a baseline in terms of cybersecurity. Another one you're going to hear a lot about, which is really relevant for our conversation, is C-27, which is also a federal bill. That one has a very good chance of passing as early as this fall and then coming into force at a later date, which we are not aware what the date would look like exactly. And it has two components. One is a privacy component, putting us much more in line with what the European standards are when it comes to privacy protections. And the second piece, obviously relevant for this conversation, is AIDA, or Artificial Intelligence Data Act, which is going to be one of the first laws in the world, in fact, and certainly one in Canada, which is going to regulate the use of artificial intelligence in the workplace, commercial or otherwise. So those are really the key ones. In addition to that, you've got sectoral requirements. Dominic alluded to standards a bit earlier. So for example, if you're in the FI or financial institution space, you would have OSFI, the Office of Superintendent of Financial Institutions, that has requirements. You have IROC that has requirements. There's a variety of them that are out there. But bigger picture, let's take a step back. Like, you don't have to know every single law in detail, across the board. But what is critical is, and I give the example of Colonial Pipeline, which is a major breach that happened a few years ago in the United States. The reason Colonial Pipeline is relevant even for this audience is it's an oil and gas pipeline. They had a major ransomware incident. They had to shut it down. But it mattered because it had impact on consumers. And in the US, all politics are local. So when you have lineups at the gas pump, Congress people, Senate people, president, they all notice. And so what happened very quickly was President Biden at the time issued an executive order to all of his agencies that were federal and said, you guys need to up your game when it comes to cybersecurity. So that it be the SEC or it be CISA, the Critical Infrastructure Security Agency, or others. The requirement was for it to be beefing up their cybersecurity. But if you look across the US and you look across all of our legislation in Canada, the baseline standards are pretty much the same. They're not telling you to have, for example, multi-factor authentication at this level or this level of encryption or what have you. They want to make sure that you are thinking about cybersecurity from a compliance standpoint. And those standards, and again, I'm not trying to be too much of a salesperson for NIST here by any stretch, but if you look at NIST, it does take into consideration local legislative changes, but has a baseline of how you can demonstrate that level of compliance from a security or maybe from a technical, physical, or administrative safeguard perspective. So my advice is always, look, take a look at your industry. If you have specific things that apply to it, make sure you comply. But if you don't have anything particular, for example, manufacturing, which Dominic was talking about earlier, this may be a good opportunity to use more universal standards like a NIST or another one that you may want to adopt like a CIS or others.
Thank you. Dominic, do you have some more to add there?
Imran said it beautifully. The only thing I would really add is, and I'll slice it again from a pragmatic lens, just because we deal with a lot of immature organizations when it comes to their cybersecurity who have just struggling to do the basics. In that, if now is the time to start doing the basics and doing them well, because you have steam trains like generative AI, which are coming down the pipe very, very fast. And if you can't deal with the cyber threats of yesterday, you're not prepared to deal with the cyber threats of today, your organization is just it's not going to survive. I certainly don't want this to come off as like fear and doubt, but recognizing that, especially what I see at the Canadian SMB level, most organizations fail to do the basics and do them well. I know, Imran, like you mentioned, stuff like multi-factor authentication, that to me is a non-negotiable. And pretty much every significant data breach or security incident that my company's been involved in over the past few years, the most common thread in all of them is that every single one of those organizations did not have MFA in place. They could have. They're all using Microsoft Azure and Microsoft Stack. They could easily have put it in. There was no barrier there. It was there. The only barrier was that people deemed it to be an inconvenience for not wanting to do it. So that I really believe that the tools and technologies are there, the processes are there, and often people know to do this, but they just aren't doing it. Sort of like knowing to eat a heart-healthy diet that's still eating Burger King 5 times a week, even though you know the consequences, kind of thing. And nothing against Burger King. I do enjoy a good Whopper here and there, but the point is that we need to do the basics. And to me, stuff like multi-factor authentication, creating systems that are securely configured and hardened according to good standards, like one from the CIS or NIST, and having good endpoint detection and protection in place. Stuff, platforms like CrowdStrike, again, but put your organization on a firm foundation to be able to build up your organization. To me, foundational stuff is a cybersecurity program. If you're building an organization now or wanting your organization to be around 5 years from now, you need to invest in the basics, at least when it comes to cybersecurity.
Wonderful. I know we also got a link from one of the participants to some resources, and sort of before the end of the webinar, we'll also get some more from you both and can kind of share some of these links. I know we've talked about with the attendees, and Imran, maybe perhaps some of your slides as well. And before I hand it off to Zane to close us out, just kind of a rapid fire to you both. Is there, in closing, one final key takeaway that you want to leave with the audience before we end today?
Dominic, why don't you kick it off? I'm going to share a slide, so give me 2 seconds to get the slide up.
Thanks, Imran. But my closing words, and I'll beat the same drum there that I was doing earlier. Don't get caught up in threats of tomorrow if your organization is not prepared to deal with the threats of yesterday or today. I see far too many organizations which are worried about AI, and don't get me wrong, yeah, that should be worried about. But the analogy I give is if there's 2 trucks about to hit you in the face, one is 5 meters away and the other one is at least 20 kilometers down the road. Let's worry about the truck that's about to strike you. Let's not worry about the truck that's down the road. Deal with the thing at present, which, like I said, for many organizations, especially at the SMB level, is basic cyber hygiene, multi-factor authentication, right? Good privileged access account management, having very strong endpoint protection in place, having good logging and monitoring in place. So when something does happen, you know what happened and be able to detect and respond as quickly and transparently as possible. Those are table stakes. If you want your organization to exist a few years from now, do those things. So I'll just beat that same drum. Hopefully that gave you enough time, Imran.
That's perfect. Thank you. I'm going to share this one slide, and Jen, absolutely happy to share these slides with the attendees if they'd like to get a copy, no
Wonderful.
problem. One slide, 5 quick wins, hopefully, that you can focus on if you want to look at mitigating any of your cyber risk, or at least controlling it to a level where you're not too concerned about it. We've talked about data mapping, knowing your data, where it is, what it is, and how it's being protected. CIRP stands for Cyber Incident Response Plan, making sure your plan, and I don't want you to have a break, but one that is practical. Contact names, people like Dominic and other advisors that you want to have in place, including a ransom negotiator if you ever need one. You don't want to be scrambling to find the right vendors during a time of crisis. I'll come to insurance in a minute, but cyber simulation, if you can do a tabletop or a simulation, doesn't have to be super complex. You just run it through. On paper, your plan can look fantastic, but until you put it around the table and have people go through a scenario, sometimes you don't always notice the gaps and the blind spots that you have there. The 4th one is contract review. If you are in a chain, so Dominic mentioned, for example, the manufacturing space, one they're very active in, you're in a supply chain, you're just in time, either you're feeding upstream or downstream, doesn't really matter, but you have business relationships. Those contracts require you to notify people and then share information with them and possibly even indemnify them in the event of a breach, or vice versa, the other way around to you. So knowing what contracts you have when you sign them, make sure you categorize and know exactly who to call and when. I've seen relationships go sideways because you didn't know which contract you had signed, and at that point, a week has passed, 2 weeks have passed, and the business partner's unhappy that you're reaching out to them last. And the last point on insurance, not a insurance expert by any stretch, but I have found cyber insurance to be extremely helpful as a way to transfer some of the risk. For many of you, if you want to get a list of vendors at discounted rates, your insurance policy typically comes with a panel of pre-approved vendors. So there's some upside to having insurance in terms of costs related to investigation, any kind of notification costs, possibly extortion payment, as well as business interruption cost. So talk to your broker, see if you're eligible, and also if you have insurance policies, see if it's sufficient given what your profile looks like. I will stop there. I know we have questions we want to probably address before we wrap up, but happy to finish off here on my end.
Thank you both. And we kind of wove them in. I was weaving them in as you guys were chatting sort of. So that was great. And as I hand over to Zane, if there's anything else that will come in sort of afterwards that, we'll reach out to you both and can kind of share those answers with the group. And thank you again for a really brilliant discussion and demystifying that. So with that, I will hand it off to Zane.
Thank you, Jen. I've just shared the screen with Dominic and Imran's details and Digital's details for our socials. Like you have also shared, we will be sending a follow-up email with any resources to our audiences that were here today. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us. And we will see you at the next IP webinar series. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.